Farewell, Stitcher, the latest from podnews.net with co-host, powerful podcast hosting for agencies and brands. One of the oldest podcast apps, Stitcher, is to close on August the 29th. An internal memo seen by Pod News says that the scale and reach of our widely distributed podcasts has been and remains a crucial accelerant for our advertising sales business. In January, Stitcher was the sixth biggest podcast app in the US, according to Podtrac, though it had lost a quarter of its users in 2 years and only had 1.3% of the market. The move means no job losses. Stitcher Studios will continue to operate as part of the successful SiriusXM podcast network. One of the biggest in the US, it represents 5 of the top 20 podcasts in the Edison Podcast Ranker. And a similar podcast app from a similar company, Acast, closed in March 2022. Stitcher Radio, as it was once called, is one of the oldest podcast apps. It was founded before the Apple App Store even existed. We look back at the history of the sometimes controversial podcast app in a special feature today. You'll find it linked from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. So now the Stitcher app is closing. What happens now? Well, we'd recommend that you check your podcast website for Stitcher links, icons and buttons and remove them. Most Stitcher website pages will be redirected to our sister app, Pandora, the company says, though that isn't available outside the US, nor is the SiriusXM app, which is due a refresh in the next few months. And if you can, consider using dynamic audio insertion to tell listeners who use Stitcher to find something else. And use that power to promote podcast apps wisely. While Apple Podcasts might be the obvious choice for iOS, you might consider recommending AntennaPod perhaps for Android, or look at some newer podcast apps you'd really recommend at podnews.net/new podcast apps. In other news, an exclusive. What's claimed to be the world's first AI news podcast has been launched. Reflected Ukraine is new and designed to be an always updating show, produced by humans and using AI with a specially designed voice. And Captivate has tweaked its memberships tool to let podcasters offer timed exclusives and free trials. The company also supports access from third-party subscription services. And thank you to Neil Mackay, who's become our latest personal supporter. People like Neil are really important to us because it means we don't have to rely on corporate interests for our reporting, especially when sometimes it's not that complimentary about some companies. We think he's the same Neil Mackay who does the Smarter Podcasting podcast and runs 7 Million Bikes podcast. In any case, you can be like Neil and support us at podnews.net/support. And in podcast news, Mission Impossible fan podcast Light the Fuse is now official. The show has joined Paramount Audio and gains the tagline, the official Mission Impossible podcast. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to watch the new movie out in cinemas on July the 12th and listen to this the day before. This Paranormal Life is celebrating more than 17 million listens with a flat world tour. The show, hosted by 2 comedians, will be in scary places like New York, Glasgow and Manchester, as well as slightly less scary places like Los Angeles, Chicago and London. Tickets go on sale on Friday. Supreme, The Battle for Roe is new from iHeart Today, a scripted podcast that delves into the inspiring story of the historic Roe versus Wade case. Bloom, a podcast that has dominated the Spanish podcast charts and won an Ondas Award, is released in English today. It's a thriller set in Switzerland and made with the special collaboration of Switzerland Tourism. And Soul Bear Sessions, where Mama At takes a deep dive into one person's extraordinary life story. The first season focuses on Terence Holloway, originally from the south central Los Angeles district of Crenshaw, a musician and movie maker who has overcome a challenging start in life and been thrown some twists along the way. It's new today from Glistening Productions. This podcast is sponsored by Co-Host and Quill. Co-Host's B2B analytics and advanced demographics dive into a listener's workplace, age, gender, income, hobbies, and social media habits. Follow brands like Expedia and PricewaterhouseCoopers who leverage these insights. Book a demo now at cohostpodcasting.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.